Okay, so quick lessons for today, or discuss lecture today, and then we're going to end with a little bit of a group conversation that is going to turn into a quick write-up related to this topic, but to the idea of special education assessments as a whole. So as we've gotten to this point where this is our last conversation about the content area assessment practices that we have. From this point on, we're going to be talking about, like I said last week, creating our own assessments and graphing and analyzing them. So you know, we've gone over the different types of assessment, we've gone over the different components of assessment within each of the subject matter areas, and then how we, to some degree, and I'd say overall, to the lack of really any meaningful degree, I'm going to make an argument for, that we adapt those practices for special education students. There is an entire, there are a couple, I don't want to say entire, there are a couple of carve out pieces that we have not really touched on yet that have to do with special education assessment for those students that are not in a position where they are going to be contacting the curriculum at all, right? We talked about portfolio assessments, we talked about alternative assessment. I think I had mentioned the unique curriculum and some of the assessments that come along with that. But as it applies to you guys who are going to, for the vast majority of you, I believe, going to be in regular education classes where you are working with special education students, what I think you should see at this point is that your students, for the most part, are going to be taking regular education assessments. They're going to be being tested on the same content in largely the same ways as your regular education students. And the amount of support, because it is an assessment and we need to find out whether our students know that content or not, the amount of support that we provide overall is really very limited, right? I think it's clear from the previous weeks where we've spoken about special education assessment, and what you're going to see today is there's nothing earth-shattering that we do differently for our special education students, right? It's kind of cutting out the, a little bit of cutting out the excess and trying to get right to the point of what you're asking for. But all the content's there, maybe a little less of it, but it's all there in principle. And then it's just what you know, right? So we're going to talk, or at the end of the day, you guys are going to talk a little bit about the pros of that, the cons of that, why that is the case, and just kind of wrapping up how we feel particularly about special education assessment in an inclusion setting. All right, that's kind of where we're landing. All right, so for today, content-wise, we are going to be talking about a few of the different math adaptations or accommodations that are made. And again, what you'll see is that what we have here is not a groundbreaking list of things that we do differently for special education students. So what are some of the most common adaptations that are met for, or that are put in place for special ed students with math assessments? One, the use of manipulatives, little counters, physical things that you can move around to help you with computation. The second, probably most used accommodation in all of special education other than extra time, is the use of a calculator. All right, so your students are almost always, or your special ed students are almost always going to have access to use of a calculator. That does not mean they have to use it, but it means that it's available. Number three, graphic organizers. So in math, what a graphic organizer is going to look like is some diagram that is used to introduce a problem. That what that diagram is going to look like is going to depend on whatever the math concept that you are doing. But that might be provided for every problem. So typically what happens in our instruction, we don't even really know this, is we provide some sort of graphic organizer to organize our thoughts, right? And then over time, we as teachers fade those graphic organizers into the background and out of the picture completely. But for our special education students, we just won't do that. So when we get to the assessment, that graphic organizer will be there available for them to organize their thoughts. What's silly about that one is that in many of the typical or many of the grade level assessments now, it says, answer this question using this method. And this method, whatever this method is the graphic organizer. So it's telling the student, use the graphic organizer to solve your work, this specific one. So in a special education assessment or accommodation, that graphic organizer might already be provided. Count, the use of prompts. So a prompt, what is a prompt going to look like on a special education math assessment? Highlighting a plus, highlighting a minus, highlighting the words within a word problem that are fundamental to answering the word problem. So Billy and Kevin would not be highlighted. Had 5 and 4 marbles respectively would be highlighted. So just the necessary information to solve whatever that problem is going to be is going to be brought forward in some way. And there might be fewer word problems. Word problems in general are, the application, as we spoke about last week, that's the application of the concept. And this is at the modification level as opposed to the accommodation level. The application is less what is critical, especially when it comes to assessing a skill through reading comprehension. We focus much more on learning of the concept for special education students. So can they do the math? Can they do the computation? Can they understand the concept? And then application is almost looked at as a bonus, all right? None of this is groundbreaking. None of this is new. None of this is wildly fascinating, right? Everything here, or everything that we see, is a way to cut through the little extra fat that might exist on a math assessment and get right to, do you have the content knowledge? All right. Unlike ELA, unlike reading, math assessments, for the most part, are cut and dry, right? It is about, you know it or you don't. You either can or you cannot do the math. Even with manipulatives, you will still get silly mistakes. Even with a calculator, you will get those mistakes. Excuse me, sorry. But the adaptations that we can provide are much more concrete. They are much more directly applicable to the subject matter. The difference largely is that with how do I want to say this? The relationship between, or the gap here, that's what I'll say. The gap between knowing number and numeracy and using it in computation is much smaller than the gap between phonics, phonemic awareness, reading, and comprehension, right? So in math, I have the Arabic numeral, so that's step one. There's knowing how many things that numeral represents, and there's knowing how to manipulate those things, all right? So knowing the number 9 knowing how many dots 9 is, and knowing how to put 9 plus 2 together. That's a much smaller range than knowing a letter, knowing the sound it makes, knowing how to put them all together, knowing what the word is, comprehending what the word is, and comprehending what it means in context, right, of a sentence or a paragraph. So when we're looking at math adaptations, there's a lot less that we have to work with, right? It's much more objective subject matter. It's much more concrete to work with in a general way, all right? So all of the adaptations that we have, they still require knowledge. They still allow for computational mistakes, but they are going to be things that are much more applicable to the subject in general, all right? So having manipulatives is much more directly related to your ability to do math than having someone read a story to you to assess reading comprehension. That's a much bigger gap than the types of adaptations that we have for math, all right? That's not to say, though, that there aren't some significant challenges that come with these adaptations. And this is kind of what I want you to be starting to think about as we get into the overall discussion on assessment accommodations and modifications. When we're talking about, and this actually applies in general education too, just to a much lesser degree. When we are adding in layers of use of graphic organizers, when we're adding in manipulatives, when we're adding in, or manipulation of manipulatives, when we're adding in teaching how to use a calculator, each of these are a skill in their own right, right? Understanding how to move around the numbers, understanding, or the manipulatives, how to set a problem up with manipulatives to represent addition or subtraction or multiplication or division. Understanding how to physically use a calculator. These are all individual skills that have to be taught. They have to be not only taught, but they have to be mastered, all right? At the younger grades, that teaching those skills is going to be just as difficult, if not more difficult, than the actual skill itself, all right? So imagine you have a child who is struggling to learn basic addition problems, all right? You are, or not just addition, but math fact problems. You've worked on, using flashcards, on writing the responses to mastery and fluency. You've done all these different things to try and get them to just know the facts, right? At the end of the day, yes, we as adults have numeracy. When I say 5 plus 4, you should know 9. There's no counting on your fingers, hopefully too much anymore. There's no drawing out dots. There's no doing all these other things, right? We spend that time to learn those things so we have automaticity. If you have a child that is struggling to acquire those facts, one way to address that might be to add in manipulatives. What have you done in this situation? You've just added in a whole nother set of stimuli, of things that the child has to learn how to work with, all right? If my goal is to get a child to know their math facts, just boom, 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 know their math facts, I don't have to rely on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, move them all over, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? there's so much room for error in the use of that. I have to, if I have the question 5 plus 4, I have to now rely on the child counting out 5 accurately, counting out 4 accurately, recognizing the addition sign, which is what really matters at the end of the day, moving them all over and counting out 9 accurately. That's a lot of work. That's going to take a lot of practice. And it leaves just as much room for error and possibly less room for future use than if I work on finding some other way to just get my child to know the facts. All right? Does that make sense? That's a little bit of a hyperbole of a situation. But what we end up seeing with all of these different adaptations is that they almost all require the use of something else. Those prompts, how to read and understand those prompts. Graphic organizers, how to read and understand the graphic organizers. Manipulatives, how to use and understand all these different things. The calculator is its own very complex thing in and of itself, right? So if I'm spending the time to teach the child how to use these other pieces to mastery, right? Because I don't want the accommodation to get in the way of demonstration of the skill, right? That's the last thing we want. The question for me becomes, is that time better used finding new ways or different ways to work with and teach the child the actual skill that you're looking for? All right. At the higher grades, this doesn't show up as much of a problem, right? Because if you've been working with a calculator for the past 10 years, hopefully, if it's still an accommodation, it is something that you are fluent with. But the question for me is, what did it take to get there? All right. Could we have used that time better on other skills, more meaningful skills, skills that were going to, that would have been more adaptable than the adaptation that we did put in? All right. The second challenge that I see with math adaptations is the practical application beyond the assessment itself. The one carve out there being calculators. Using calculators, or the use of calculators, is a very important skill, right? And I absolutely think it's fine that a child with special needs walks around with a calculator all day and uses it to help them with any math problems. Why? Because we all do too, right? I consider myself to be pretty good at math. If I'm doing important calculations for my finances or for purchases or whatever, I'm relying on my calculator, right? It's faster, it's more accurate, it's less thought for me. So teaching a child to use a special education student to use a calculator has a lot of applicability beyond the assessment. That used to be one that we actually questioned a lot, is should we be teaching children to do math with calculators, special education students to rely on math with calculators, because adults don't walk around with calculators in their pockets, but that question is now gone, right? So that is definitely something that is very, very useful. But manipulatives, graphic organizers in particular, have no practical use, efficient practical use outside of an assessment setting. I don't think I could do it anymore. But when I was, I can't remember what it looked like, but when I was teaching in second grade, I was teaching one of my special ed kids to make change from an amount, I think it was within $10. Yeah, that's what it was. Make change from an amount within $10. And I'm not even going to try and draw it out, but it had the starting amount, and over here it had the total that I was paying with. So I had $10. I had the amount that I was paying, or wherever it was, and there were these boxes and arrows and plus signs, and like it was this like 10 or 15 step graphic organizer that I had built for him on how to figure out how to make change. And it was applicable beyond $10, obviously. And he got so fluent with it. Like he was really, 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 really good with it. Like totally set. He could make change within these amounts. Couldn't do without it. So if he wanted to figure out how much change, he needed a piece of paper. He had to draw his boxes, his arrows, do all the math, do all the calculations along the whole way. And he's not going to do that while in line at a grocery store. And that was predicated on the fact that I taught him the concept, but I could have just taught him to punch it in a calculator too. So he knew how to do it by hand, which has no practical application. You guys see that? And that, I got lucky in that case. That skill, one, he was a higher functioning kid. Two, that skill didn't take a lot of time to teach him. But if that was the direction that I had decided to go for someone else, it could have taken a month just to teach that graphic organizer, because it was pretty complex, right? And in that time, no, maybe I wouldn't have taught that specific skill, but I could have taught some other foundational skill. I could have taught something else. I could have taught how to use that calculator. So finding the balance between the accommodation that is going to allow us to accurately assess versus allow the student the ability to learn something that they are going to be able to use in the future. That's a tough balance, right? The need for assessment is so high right now from a stakeholder perspective, not from a child perspective, a stakeholder perspective. And I think when it comes to our special education students, there is a lot of time that is really spent on teaching what is necessary to get to the assessment that could be potentially used on just teaching the raw skills. And I think my takeaway question for special education assessment for you guys, and no, there's no answer, I haven't even settled on an answer for myself, is what direction should we be going? What do we think is the best way forward, I guess? All right. So first of all, are there any questions about the types of accommodations that we have up here, the challenges, the little that I put up there? It's straightforward, right? Like I said, nothing earth-shattering, nothing groundbreaking. But I find that is the problem. And that is the problem in special education assessment, particularly at the inclusion level, all right? Again, in self-contained classrooms for a small percentage of students, we have the ability to do alternative assessments. But we are talking about maybe half a dozen children in any given school. I guess a little more at high school, but it is such small numbers. Every other student is getting assessed on the grade level with accommodations. Everyone. It's a lot of students who are not really able to keep up with the material who are going to be assessed on that material. So this becomes my question to you guys. So as we've covered with ELA, reading, and math, and we've seen that much of special education assessment is about modification and accommodation related to the curriculum, as opposed to meaningful, valid, and reliable assessments designed for special education students. Why have we gotten here? That's the first question for you guys. Why are we here now? 2, is this the right direction for inclusion in particular to take? There are a lot of good reasons why we should be pushing this type of assessment for special education students, but there's also a flip side to that. And then what are 3 pros and cons of the accommodations and modifications of assessment across the board? All right, sound good? So let's do, this is our last chance to do some different groups before our final projects. So why don't we do groups of 4, just move around throughout the room. One paper per group, or one write-up per group. And before the end of class, we're going to come back together and share some of those responses. Okay, sound good? All right, cool. Go ahead. Okay, so based on whatever is said over the next 15 or 20 minutes or so, if you guys want to add to or amend any of your responses, you like what someone else said, you want to incorporate that, by all means go ahead. For those that are doing the online section and are listening to this, they're going to be hearing your responses and discussion probably before they even write their own. You know, the sole originality of ideas is not what I'm going for here, but rather I want you guys to be able to put the whole thing together and really start to have an opinion on some of these things. These are not topics that have correct answers. These are not topics that you are going to agree with everyone on, including your principals, including parents, including whomever. You're going to be in classrooms with special education students who you have to accommodate for in some way, and you disagree, but you have to do it, or you can't do it. Whatever that disagreement is, it's going to exist. These are very real problems, not just in special education, but in education overall right now. All right. So first question here, how do you think we got here? Why is it the case that there aren't these really robust means of providing assessment opportunities specifically for special education students? What do you think?
We talked about how schools have gotten so big.
Okay.
Especially public schools, where I was talking about at Central High School, right down the road. In one of my math classes, we had up to like 34 people. And if 2 of those people were special needs, they would get completely ran over. If everyone had an individualized plan, the teacher would never be able to sleep or eat or do anything ever again. So it's that, and funding. Like I mentioned about how it can be fixed if we had these huge mega schools with like hundreds of teachers to put 10 students in each class.
Gotcha.
But we have these massive classrooms with
we have the opposite.
Yeah, an understaffed school.
Good. So it's definitely a numbers issue, right? Like, first of all, it takes so much to educate and assess the general education population. Putting the same amount of resources into the special education population, there's a fraction of the size of the general population, it is not practical. I'm not saying it's not the right thing to do. It's not a practical thing to do. And there's definitely a component to that. Yeah.
So many variations of special education, not each special education student learns.
Absolutely. That is a great point. So when we talk about valid and reliable, when you're talking about a general education population, And it's not even really different in that way, because you can break a gen ed population into all these different subgroups, right? That would be an easy thing to do. But when you look at the bell curve of general education, we are okay with that concept. When you look at special education, just taking autism, right? There's all these different types of or effects of autism. There are all these different learning styles and quirks and intricacies just within that one disability. And then you add in Down syndrome, and you add in visual impairments, you add in vision impairments, and every single one, to get valid and reliable, there's absolutely no way that you could have a single assessment that is valid for a child with autism and a child that is blind. Like, they're nowhere near related, obviously, right? So looking at valid and reliable for special education, by definition, can't be a thing. Excellent point. Excellent point. Yeah.
We talked about how while it's important to assess that the students have know the skill and know the topic, like it's more important that they like to learn it. So it's more focused on the curriculum and making sure that they can do it and like learn it.
Awesome.
Getting them to learn it.
Excellent. So yeah, absolutely, I know what you mean. One of the points that I wanted to make sure I left today, and now is when I get to make it, well done, is the important piece of special education assessment is in the teaching, right? We, on one of the previous slides, it was just up there as almost like an afterthought. Keeping in mind teaching to mastery levels, right? So in special education, more so than in general education, we teach to mastery. We should be teaching to mastery. That means that there was a point where the child will know the skill, period, and a story. They can do it to the level of independence that we deem necessary. Assessment as a whole is about is one about knowing the skills, but we've already demonstrated that our children know the skills, so we taught to mastery. But it's also about discriminating when to use the skills. That's important, that's critically important, but that's assessing something different than do you know how to do it. All right, that's a really, really good point. Awesome. What else? What else? These are great responses. Try and get two more. Wait, that was 3 groups. Let's try and get one more. Taylor, go ahead.
I mean, we kind of just, we saw it as special education has in the past been its own kind of working machine, and general education was its own working machine, and you're collaborating these two similar but different machine types, and just certain things just don't match. And so what tends to give more lately is the special education side rather than the general education side, and like the system that they have going on in general ed, rather than, because we like have to adapt with time. And
I think that the first part I completely agree with, but I think that what we have now is actually more of an extension of what you're talking about in that first part. You are talking as opposed to like a bifurcation. And the thought that I had earlier was, when I was writing this, was like, when did this start? Like, where, how did we get there? For me, there's an inflection point. There's a singular thing that I think set us on this path. It was inevitable, but I think we got here today through what Taylor just said, through No Child Left Behind. I think I know that was the first law that said, doesn't matter what you are, you have to master all these skills. And now all of a sudden, in our field, the first question was, even special education at 100% on grade level? Oh crap, what do we do, right? And everything since then, even though that law is no longer there, everything since then has been how, like, with that mindset, or with that frame of mind in place, that really shifted how we think. And for better or worse, we haven't reverted out of that yet. Education's a pendulum. At some point, we will look at special education a different way. But I believe that that is why we are in this position now. Yeah.
We actually talked about, that's how I looked down when we were talking about it, and I mentioned how I felt like I was being dragged through education because I really didn't know how to do any sort of math until I was like 10. I went to Max Charter right there,
Mhm,
helped
mhm.
with that. But I just felt like I was being left behind while being pushed forward.
Yep.
Because they didn't let me take my time and understand what I was learning.
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I forget, you guys literally grew up in a No Child Left Behind environment. Like that was passed when I was exiting K-12. And you guys experienced it, you know, from not even from a special education side, but just the push and pull in a regular ed and the testing environment and everything like that didn't exist before. I think I can't remember if it was with you guys, but state testing for me was like this ish week that you kind of prepared for a little bit, and maybe you got like a little scholarship if you did really well, but no one cared. There wasn't this thing around testing. Just wasn't there, wasn't present. That shifted with No Child Left Behind. And now I go into schools in March and April, and my God, if you make a sound, right? Phones in the car, computers in the car, gas masks and the whole thing, right? It's insane what the environment that exists in a school during testing week or weeks now. And it's early in the year, right? Relatively speaking. It's not this end of year thing. And that trickles down into special education. And I think that that's a challenge, right? So good. I think those are some great reasons as to why we are where we are. So, is this the path we should continue on?
Ideally.
Ideally,
but
no.
I don't feel like there's much way to get around it unless, because I think this is, I would love a world where we could individualize everyone's education plan. But that's not practical whatsoever. But I do think we should start shifting more towards specializing special education plans rather than simply, but like I said earlier, sometimes you have one teacher for like 200 students and like 20 of those can be special needs
Mhm.
or have some form of learning disability, and the teacher cannot curate to all of those students, like make them individual assessments because they just won't have time to.
And the concept that the framework that you're coming from a secondary perspective is different than that of an elementary, right? So with elementary, you're thinking of, okay, here are my 28 kids, maybe 2 of them have special needs, and I can kind of curate that. But if you're a secondary English teacher, secondary math teacher, and 200 kids come through your door every week, and you have to think, okay, there's 3 kids in this class, 3 kids in that class, 5 kids in that class, that's a whole nother ballgame, right? One of the challenges with this question is we are understandably stuck in this mindset of our current practices now, overall in education, which is a grades-based system as opposed to a competencies-based system. Is that the right thing to do? You know what I mean by that? That makes sense? When I didn't love everything about the district that I was in when I was teaching, but I absolutely loved their report card. A report card was the most beautiful thing in assessment that I've ever seen. There's a continuum, K through 12. By the end of 12th grade, you got to know all these things. But, you know, we limited it to K through 6 and then secondary. But you could be a 2nd grade student and you just highlighted whatever skills they had. And then it got passed up. And then your 3rd grade teacher added to it. Then it got passed up and the 4th grade teacher added to it. And they didn't have grade levels attached to them. They didn't have A, B, C, D attached to them. They had, you know, progressing, needs work, some other letter for exemplary. And it didn't require, it didn't put a grade in a box. It didn't put a student in the box of that grade. Now what happened as a result of that is teachers started appropriately filling out all the skills their kids had. So you had a 2nd grader on a 4th grade or 5th grade level, and it was filled out because they passed the assessment, they did this, they demonstrated that skill. And then on the other end, you had kids that were really struggling, who were in 2nd grade and they weren't getting out of the kindergarten level, right? So then they put a rule in place that you had to fill up to at least the level below your grade and couldn't go more than 1 level above your grade. So they still put it in some sort of box, right? But that was a competencies-based assessment scale, which was so much more, I felt, was so much more powerful than this grade level mastery. Yeah.
Do you think that applies to secondary as well? Because I find secondary starts to become a lot more about competition and numbers and funding and those sort of things as time goes on.
I think what's harder for me with secondary is that there are just lots of different subjects. There's more subject matter. So if you have a language subject matter, that doesn't start at the kindergarten level, right? You may take 2 years of Spanish or 3 years of Spanish or 4, right? So there's all these different, there's not the same range of skills to evaluate. Or like geometry is one thing, but I guess it would be on the continuum, but there's a ceiling at that point, right? So it's harder at secondary, but I still think it's usable, all right? So when you're thinking about is this the right direction? If your answer is no, then you need to be thinking out of the box. If not this, then what? And the then what is not something that's in front of you right now, because this is what is in front of us. So we have this grades-based mastery assessment-based system. So if your answer to that is no, then tell me, think creatively, right? What is the next? Does anyone think that this is a good direction? Should we be, and there's arguments for this, and I will argue for some of those arguments, but should we be putting our, I want to say holding our special education students to the same standard, because that to me is a teaching problem, not an assessment problem. But should we be in this system? Does anyone think yes? It's okay if you do.
Yes, to some things, but not to others.
Okay.
So I'll consider that no.
That's fair. No, that's probably the right answer, right? Like we're not going to throw the whole system out. There are good ideas to it. At the end of the day, we still have to know, right? Can you do the things that your peers can do? And if not, then what can you do? Like, we need to know that. As a society, we need to know that. As stakeholders, we need to know whether we have effective teachers for our special education students. And one way is a level playing field, level comparison playing field, right? Not perfect, but it's a measure. It's accurate to some degree. Yeah.
I always look at it through that second, because I'm not going to be working with kids. Well, I'm going to be working with bigger kids.
Yes.
But I always look through it from the secondary education point of view, especially high school, which is where I want to teach. But I find that accommodations and modifications work the best there, especially with the higher grade levels where you're trying to get everybody at a grade level, like grade appropriate level with all of their work. But some students like might not be able to reach that tier and they might need a little bit of help to get there. But with like lower levels, like elementary school, a lot of students will be working in vastly different ways, doing vastly different things, and everybody's learning different at that time.
One of the arguments, we have this conversation a lot in one particular parish that I work in, or work with rather. And the argument at the secondary level is if they can learn anything from exposure, then that's what we want to do, right? And again, this is more on instruction side, but that narrows the gap that you're working with. We're talking about Louisiana history at a high school level. Whatever you get from it, you get from it. That's very different than we're learning to read, and I'm reading the words on a kindergarten level, and I'm reading the words on a fourth grade level, right? So because you're not teaching the foundational skills, you're relying on what's already there as a like static skill set. In elementary, you have a harder job to some degree because you are creating what will become that static skill set, and you want it to be as strong as possible. Good. Couple of pros, couple of cons. What's a good thing about this accommodation modification framework that we work with right now? Yeah.
It helps teachers a good bit. I know that's very weird because like normally we like to talk about the students, but it helps teachers a good bit, especially coming from the secondary perspective, where you have these massive classrooms and a massive amount of students that you can't get at once. So these accommodations can really help students who are being left behind not be so much left behind.
Good.
Especially if it's if it's like a classroom, like I said, of 34 people, if you can't get to that student, then there's some other nets to help them from falling.
Awesome. So it gives teachers something they know that there's a backstop. At the end of the day, I know I'm going to be able to read them their assessment. At the end of the day, I know I'm going to be able to do this or provide them this, right? I'm going to flip that. Is that also a con? Yeah, because I don't have to do this because. So I think I totally agree that goes on both sides. Good. What else? Let's go one more, and then you're free.
I think like how you said earlier, like it helps arrange the different special education students, like not just one type, but like.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So when you look at the list of available accommodation, there's like 100 on there. It's not a small amount. Not everyone is going to be applicable for every student, but there's something on there that should be able to help any student, right? So we are looking through the accommodations. We are looking at the variability in the types of disabilities that we are working with, where the different behaviors that we see, the different learning styles we see, the different everything. There is something for everyone on there. Same thing, is that also a con? And the answer has to be yes. It's a very overwhelming list. And there are some very key pieces, and I know I've mentioned this before, that seem like they would help anyone. And that's not always the case. So when we consistently see time and a half, when we consistently see test row lab, when we consistently see a couple others, calculators, right? Is that actually impactful to the current disability and child intersection? Or are we just checking the box because it's some things to do? Good, yeah.
I find that sometimes giving an accommodation to students can sometimes harm their growth as well. As in, like, I tutor, and someone I tutored, he could hardly read. He has dyslexia. I have dyslexia. Of course, I know there's a range, but people had been giving him notes, and he had been reading them. Of course, he read well, but he couldn't write well. He couldn't write fast. So whenever he got to college, he couldn't take these notes like he could have if he would have been able to take notes and not have purely accommodations given to him throughout his entire high school.
And you know, there's the, do you put the child in the position to learn to survive, or do you keep them buoyed with their peers, which eventually is going to be pulled away when you're in a meeting, in a staff meeting? No one's going to be taking notes for you, right? We work in education, we work with nice people, they might, but you know, outside of this field, that's not going to be the case. And that practical application, which I mentioned today, that's something that absolutely has to be considered as we're looking at these accommodations. Good. Thank you for that discussion. I hope that helps not clear things up, but you know, gives you comfort, give you confidence in forming some of your ideas on what we should be doing with this. All right, cool. No class on Thursday. Take your time on getting this in next week-ish sometime. Bring your math assessment assignments to class on Tuesday. We may not get to it Tuesday, we definitely will Thursday, but we're going to start using those consistently. Okay? Have a good one.